Good evening, listeners, brave navigators of the enigmatic and the concealed. Have you ever felt the pull of the unanswered, the allure of the mysteries that shroud our existence? For more than a decade, a unique comic publisher has dared to dive into these mysteries, unafraid of the secrets they might uncover. This audacious entity is Paranoid American. Welcome to the mystifying universe of the Paranoid American podcast.
Launched in the year 2012, Paranoid American has been on a mission to decipher the encrypted secrets of our world. From the unnerving enigma of MK Ultra mind control to the clandestine assemblies of secret societies. From the awe-inspiring frontiers of forbidden technology to the arcane patterns of occult symbols in our very own pop culture. They have committed to unveiling the concealed realities that lie just beneath the surface. Join us as we navigate these intricate landscapes, decoding the hidden scripts of our society and challenging the accepted perceptions of reality.
Folks, I've got a big problem on my hands. There's a company called Paranoid American making all these funny memes and comics. Now, I'm a fair guy. I believe in free speech as long as it doesn't cross the line. And if these AI-generated memes dare to make fun of me, they're crossing the line.
This is your expedition into the realm of the extraordinary, the secret, the shrouded. Come with us as we sift through the world's grand mysteries, question the standardized narratives, and brave the cryptic labyrinth of the concealed truth. So strap yourselves in, broaden your horizons, and steel yourselves for a voyage into the enigmatic heart of the Paranoid American podcast, where each story, every image, every revelation brings us one step closer to the elusive truth.
Hey, it's another episode of the Paranoid American podcast, and today we're talking about a topic I care about a whole lot. In fact, I try and shoehorn it into almost any episode where it seems like there's a place to do it, but now it's going to be the main focus, and I've got another fellow enthusiast, all two of us. I'm going to assume that there's like exactly two in the entire planet that care about this topic as much as we do. Kaleb Graves, a.k.a. what I'm just going to call you, the Salvia guy. For the short term,
Sure.
which used to be my nickname, but now I'm going to give that one to you because that's what we're going to be talking about, Salvia Divinorum. But you were also telling me that this isn't like your one-trick pony. In fact, this is just a tangent of a whole different area that we'll get into. So welcome to the show, Kaleb Graves, and tell people where they can find you, who you are, all the good stuff.
Hey, yeah, you can find me at psychedelictheology.com or Psychedelic Theology on Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok, pretty much all the big social medias. I also have my podcast, the Psychedelic Theology podcast, and I'm always open to have conversations with folks I meet online, which is how you and me got connected, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think I found you on Reddit. I usually go there. It's very disheartening place to go now. It's very different from what it used to be, I think. Sometimes I just go there for the punishment. It's almost like I'm flagellating myself to hear people just completely disagree and dismiss all the things that I hold dear. Salvia being one of them. So again, like what's wrong with us that we care about Salvia and no one else does?
You know, I think Salvia got a really bad rap in the early to mid 2000s, where this is Salvia is just a little green shrub. It's similar to, as I'm sure you know, mint, basil, in that same genus, that same family. And while it is the single most naturally occurring psychedelic on the planet, I think that people have really misused it in a lot of ways, haven't listened to indigenous wisdom about it particularly, and also just watched too many ABC primetime special editions that gave them bad understandings of what they'd experienced before they tried it or decided not to try it.
So you're saying the original indigenous use was not to smoke it out of a bong on live stream and then fall out of your window?
Yeah, shockingly not. It was not just to do something funny for the Vine in the mid 2000s.
It was Vine, wasn't it? Oh
yeah,
my
it
God.
was
Vine killed.
there.
How ironic is it that Vine ends up killing a psychedelic?
I know. But yeah, this substance is salvia is incredibly powerful. And I think if you're not ready for what you can experience with it, and don't have a good education understanding, particularly because it was so widely available. So people who had never tried shrooms, had never tried acid, never tried DMT, none of the classical psychedelics, just went right in for this. It's actually an opioid receptor-based psychedelic. So really weird and very different from our classical psychedelics.
Right, compared to almost every other known psychedelic, which is serotonergic, meaning it'll bind with your serotonin receptors, but this one binds with your kappa opioid receptor, which makes it stand out like a weird thumb in the middle of this sea of other psychedelics, especially if you get into all the synthesized stuff. It all just kind of tweaks like serotonin based experiences. So what does that actually mean? Like, what does it mean that it's binding to a completely different receptor? Is there anything else at all like salvia that binds to kappa opioid receptors?
Well, so one of the things that we know about salvia is that the primary agonist, meaning what acts on the receptors, is called salvinorin A. But there's also salvinorin B, which is very hard to sort of synthesize out of the plant to isolate, and salvinorin C, which I'm not aware of any trip reports or any chemists who've attempted to create that. So there's a little family of active ingredients that are either found in salvia or are derived from salvinorin A and its little family there. But what connects salvia to psychedelics instead of just being a dissociative is its effects neurologically on the default mode network, the way our brain normally talks to itself when it's sort of in a default state, when maybe you're daydreaming or you're hard at work, you're not having active thoughts, you're more internally focused. Psychedelics shake everything up, change how these different parts of the brain talk to each other. And salvia does that in a exceptionally powerful way, which might be because it affects opioid receptors, but it's still carrying out the same cross-brain neurological pattern that you'd see for, or similar one to what you'd see for LSD, DMT, that sort of thing. So it fits in that same category, even if it's its own weird little thing. You could also argue that it's just because something works on the opioid receptors obviously doesn't mean that it's addictive. That's something important to get thrown out there. But what you see with like kava in particular, which I think it doesn't work on the kappa opioid receptors. I think it mostly works on the mu opioid receptors. But that's another substance known to be hallucinogenic that works on our opioid receptors at high enough doses, but it doesn't fit in the psychedelic category like salvia does, which really makes it a unique substance in a lot of ways.
All right, I am so excited about all the different avenues we can get into. I'm really so. Let's rewind a little bit. Let me just take a step back for anyone that's not a complete enthusiast. And I guess some housekeeping. Normally, I'm based in Florida, but I moved my entire house to Georgia so that I could talk about this because it's legal in Georgia. It's not legal in Florida. So just to be clear, I am not advocating anyone do any of this. This is for educational, informational purposes only. Unless you're in Georgia, then have fun and have a blast. And I'll be back in Florida right after this interview. I'm going to move my house again. But how did you find salvia? What year was it? What was the context? I want to just understand your first impressions, like how you even discovered it.
So I knew I had friends in the turn of 2010, 2011 when people were really using it across the country. I had a lot of friends who back at that time and even since then have been really more of those gas station psychonauts. So if it's something that you read the ingredients and the ingredients say proprietary blend and you have absolutely no idea what's in there, they tried all of it, which is not my style, but if I don't think that's particularly safe, but they were brave enough to go for it.
I won't cast any stones. I've maybe experimented with some gas station shamans as well.
Yeah, it's fine. It's part of the world that we live in because the government has improperly scheduled so many different substances. That stuff that's legitimately dangerous can be free and legal out on the market, but substances that we know have really true healing capacities and long history of medicinal use continue to be criminalized. But so that was my first impression of it, was seeing it on YouTube and hearing about it from my friends, and just wondering, in that time, my world was very, very small. I grew up in a really conservative fundamentalist sort of situation. So I sort of thought all drugs were just weed. That's all you had was marijuana. So this, especially because it looked like an herb too, my brain was still stuck in, oh, this is just really, really strong pot.
I
It
like
wasn't
that.
an yeah, like that's all. I mean, it's the same thing that middle schoolers selling each other dried basil in a bag. It's not that much different looking. Um,
Getting high
but
off
yeah,
that placebo effect. Yeah.
exactly,
And
exactly.
also, I remember too, around like elementary, maybe early middle school, I just assumed that anyone doing any drug at all was just on their way to being a murderer. Like that's the only reason you would do drugs, is because that's what murderers did, because they were all just criminals. Like just lump them into one. That's what Dare taught me. So that's kind of how I perceived it for the longest time.
Right, and that's exactly how I perceived it too. It was a way to put the bad, quote unquote, bad guys into a criminal category where you could keep them over there, and keep your nice little suburban ticky-tacky house, white picket fence life going. But it really wasn't until I started studying psychedelics in seminary that salvia came back into my purview again. Um,
In the context of seminary, or was it like unrelated?
Oh, it was in the context of seminary. This was what ended up being my specialty when I was finishing up my divinity degree, was in psychedelics and alternative states of consciousness. So that's when I started with all the classical stuff: LSD, DMT, mescaline, shrooms. But as I started looking into this, not only the big wide world of like designer drugs, the stuff that comes from the labs, but all of the different psychedelic substances that are either less universally pleasurable or harder to find, that I stumbled upon salvia again and was just fascinated by the studies I was seeing on how it worked, on the indigenous history of use. Everything about it just was absolutely fascinating to me.
So I'll just give some context too for where I came into it, since that's actually interesting to talk to someone that found out about salvia through the crazy YouTube videos, and after all of the lore had sort of saturated the rest of the world, and then be like, maybe I will try that, because
Right.
my experience was a totally different. I came across this in, I think, ninth grade of high school. It was like 1998, maybe. I think it was like 97 or 98. And all I remember was my friends like, hey, they got this new stuff at the head shop. It's totally legal, but it'll floor you, you know? And it's like, okay, whatever. I had been through the time of High Times would sell like wizard weed in the back of the magazine, which was basically just some inert plant that looked cool. And they would just be like, ooh, how will this make you feel? Long story short, not very great. Just, kind of like you just smoked a bunch of random grass off the lawn. But
Right.
this salvia, it did floor me. Like I remember being fused with the chair, laughing uncontrollably. Sweat was literally like spraying out of my head, like they were like pressure backed jets. It was an insane experience, and I couldn't believe it was totally different from anything that I had come across. And when I went back to the head shop to see, like, okay, what is this exactly? It was just little glass vials that someone had used like an inkjet printer to print out a label that said incense. And they had 5x incense and 10x incense. And that was it. That was all the information that I had. No one said it was called Salvia Divinorum. It could have been a chemical. It was just like little black flakes that kind of smelled a little bit strong, tasted horrible if you put it in your mouth. And it had this very profound effect. And it was only after maybe a year of doing this constantly because it was free and it was cheap. And but also we were just going on like aroid.org, I think. And one time I'm searching around and someone had an article. It was like, hey, has anyone seen this stuff being sold as 5x incense or 10? I think I found it through 5x or 10x. And then and I went down this rabbit hole of, okay, it's Salvia Divinorum. And this name kept popping up. And at the time, it didn't mean anything to me. It was Robert Gordon Wasson. And he was the guy that essentially had discovered this. I just imagine some hippie Indiana Jones out in the world finding like mushrooms and, you know, all sorts of psychedelic plants and bringing them back to the country. We'll get to that later because that's a whole different rabbit hole with who Wasson actually was and what he was doing. But so this was my first introduction. There was there was an internet, but there was no YouTube. There was no one outside of this one thread on Aroid talking about, hey, what's this 5x incense and putting these pieces together. So my entire first impression of this over 5 or 6 years was pre people falling out of windows. And the number one thing that I encountered was people hated it. They absolutely hated the experience. And there's different phases to it, right? So I guess my subjective understanding of this, without even doing any of like the research, like I did the field research, but not the book research, but that there was very specific phases. It would start with uncontrollable laughing to the point of being uncomfortable with it, not like a fun type. Like it's funny after a few minutes, but after like 10 or 15 minutes of uncontrollable laughing, like your throat hurts, like you're running out of tears. It's a very unpleasant experience. That would usually turn most people off from trying it any further. And it also seems that if you get caught up in how unpleasant that experience is or trying to stop it, then that's kind of the end. Like once you stop laughing and you kind of come back to normal, experience over. Then you got another phase where, okay, you're laughing and you start getting really hot and sweaty. I don't know if this is universal, but I've seen it happen to countless people. And then if you can make it through that, then there's like a disorientation aspect where you're kind of in like this weird limbo state and you're like calling out to people, and like some people would try and like re-ravel themselves so they feel their body is unraveling or spinning and they try and counteract it. And this is usually when people are falling out of chairs or falling out of windows. They're sort of trying to like do the opposite of what the world is doing. The world's spinning this way. I'm going to spin this way. Best way I can describe it. And then there's this next level that is just complete dissociation. You're no longer a human being on the planet Earth. You don't have an age or feelings or thoughts. You're just like somewhere out in the ether. And then it also seems that most people never even get through all of those different phases. Some people will hit the first one, some people will hit the second one, some people hit the third, but it's very rare to meet someone that has gone through all of those ones because it's almost like there's these built-in barriers. Like if you're not ready for it or if you can't handle it, here's a whole bunch of reasons to not do it. So this is, I think, explains why I haven't found anyone else that really has enjoyed doing this or been interested in it. And I guess I'll tack on a final observation too, is I realized quite early on that it is not a party. It's not a social thing. In fact, even having a sitter in a room, which is highly recommended, kind of kills the whole vibe. Like, the only and best way, in my opinion, after decades of being aware of this, completely dark room, fans off, no air. Like I don't even want air to flow across my skin. I don't want any external stimuli of any kind, sound, noise, maybe some water if you like really need it, but just like completely still with nothing else to take you out of this experience, because it's not about what's happening out here. It's all about what's happening inside your head, essentially. So that doesn't sound fun. If you're like, hey guys, everyone come over. Okay, don't talk. Don't talk for 2 hours. Turn all the lights off. Turn the AC off. You know, like don't put the TV on. Don't put music on. All of a sudden it's like, oh, let's just smoke a joint then. Let's not do all of this if it's going to be all involved. So.
Yeah, it's interesting to thinking about. It's really interesting thinking about just how what you were saying about people's embodied experience of it, like they're being unraveled or spinning, or the laughing and crying, the somatic element of it. Like somatic elements of psychedelics are very normal. It's normal to feel like a lot of body load or to feel different when your tactile sense is touching things. But the sense of actually that Salvia gives of actually your body your body not just disappearing, but you can feel the process of it happening. I think part of the other reason it's really disturbing for people is that's a little bit more disturbing than something like plain ego death, where you're in your body, you're not in your body. You don't get to feel the process like being beamed up on the Enterprise of pieces sort of falling off over a period of time.
That's a great way of describing. I've also heard, my favorite way I've heard this described, and it's one of those things where you hearing it without actually ever having gone through it might not make as much sense, but this was the one that made the most sense to me. It is, you are physically feeling a transition from being 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional and then to like 1-dimensional, and that whole feeling of fusing with a wall, or your body like spreading across like an infinite plane and spinning around and twirling. That's kind of what would happen if you try to take a 3-dimensional object and turn it into a 2-dimensional object. So that's it's hard to relate to, I understand, if no one's felt that, but that's the feeling.
Yeah, and what I think people really don't get either is just our entire understanding of consensus reality is sort of an illusion or a play that our senses and our sense of self has built for us. So one of the experiments some of the experiments that they're doing in neurology right now are just really, really insane for figuring out what our sense of self is. One of my favorites is being able to take a magnet and put it over somebody's head on a particular part of the brain responsible for recognizing people's faces. And people will no longer recognize close family, like their spouses or children or parents. They can describe the face in perfect, intricate detail, but they cannot actually recognize who this person is. In the same way, there are many different things that our sense of equilibrium is doing, that our bodies is tactily doing with our sense of balance, or knowing where all of our parts of our body are, or turning a lot of what we see upside down as our eyes see it, and turning that into a right side up. Turning the two different angles that our eyes see into one vision, and the depth perception that's created out of that. All of this is coming from so many parts of our minds that we don't even see work. And Salvia just shakes all those up. So it's not even that when I like what you said about being turned into 2-dimensional or 1-dimensional, there are parts of our minds responsible for only noticing the 2-dimensional, and it needs help communicating with another part of our brain to turn that into 3-dimensional. And Salvia, maybe, who knows, Salvia might just turn that off. It turns off and turns on a lot of different communication in the brain that doesn't make any sense. It would never happen under normal circumstances, and this is the experience we get.
So are there any medicinal uses of Salvia or Salverin A or B?
We've unfortunately had some how to say this, therapeutic block when it comes to figuring out what these substances are good for. Part of it is the paradigm that it's being used for psychedelic research right now is either using it in sort of a microdose way, all psychedelics in a microdose way, as if it's just a replacement for antidepressants, or you're sort of supposed to interpret the trip and figure out like, oh, how does this connect to your childhood, or how does this connect to
psychoanalysis?
Right, psychoanalysis. You just can't do that with Salvia in the same way. So we don't have a lot of evidence for its medicinal use in Western medicine. But among like the Mazatec people of Oaxaca, Mexico, who have used this as a medicinal plant for thousands of years, they absolutely would say that this has medicinal benefit. When I've used it, and I've never, I think this is the post that we got connected on. I've never smoked Salvia. The only way I've used Salvia is by chewing, by holding it under my tongue and chewing in little bundles, because that's the way that the Mazatec people would say it's respectful to use this plant. And when I've done that and had time to sit and think about the experience and how, very similar to the normal way you do psychoanalysis with psychedelics. I've personally had a lot of medicinal effect from it. It's been very beneficial. But I think it's just a little bit too chaotic in its smoked form or in its pure form. If you isolate it's really chaotic and really amazing, but not necessarily something anybody except the most seasoned psychonauts can get a ton out of.
Fair point. And I guess that's another interesting topic specific to salvia to get into, are the modes of ingestion. So like you mentioned, the most traditional way is you bundle up a bunch of the leaves and you just kind of chew it and you let it absorb sublingually. So it bypasses the whole digestion process, goes right into the bloodstream essentially. That one I think I started out after I found out what was in the little incense 5X vials at the head shop. And I realized that, I went and found a direct source, because once I knew it was called Salvia Divinorum, you could order online by like the pound. It was dirt cheap back then too. So I kind of tried it all. I got the loose leaves. I got some tincture that you could just put directly in your mouth. And then I got 5, 20, 150, 100. There was even like a 600X at one point called Elephant Killer. Tried all of them. I've done all of them. And you're absolutely correct that the smoked form is more chaotic, although this is the other part that was so fascinating, and it almost seems like I'm just making this up or it's like a weird woo-woo claim, but I swear that I've seen this happen to myself and other people, this odd concept called reverse tolerance. So unlike a lot of other psychedelics or any drug on the planet, even over-the-counter drugs, even things that like the steroids that open your nasal passage up when they get stuffy, all of those, you adapt to it over time, and you have to keep raising the dose because you're becoming more and more acclimated to it. You're developing an actual tolerance. But something that I read in one of those early Wasson reports, I think, or maybe someone writing about them, was this concept of inverse tolerance, meaning that the more you do salvia, the less you have to do it over time. So originally, loose leaf did nothing for me, but it was like once I had done 20 and 50 and Elephant Killer and all this stuff, now all of a sudden the loose leaf could get me right there too, just like this crazy high extract version. And the only way that I've been able to make it make sense in my own brain is that it's almost like you keep going like to the same place. You keep driving to the same place over and over again. Eventually, like, you know the way to get there. You don't get lost on the way there. You don't hit all the traffic lights because you know the way to go that's the most efficient. And it almost felt like that. It felt like after being forced to drive an F1 car to that place every time, where it's like, oh my God, I don't even know how to steer this thing. Sometimes you crash. Sometimes you overshoot it. But once you go there enough times fast, then all of a sudden it's like you can go there slow but still make it on time. That analogy might be falling apart a little bit, but that was one of the things that, like, this can't be real. I've never heard of anything else on the planet that has this inverted tolerance dynamic applied to it. So is there any truth to that? Is this just my own subjective bias from reading that and putting it onto it? Or have you noticed that or found any documentation about it?
That's interesting. Outside of like the similar, the Wasson report, similar early reports of like, this is what people that are using this say happen. It's interesting because what I mentioned earlier, that you have kava, which also works on opioid receptors. That is a known reverse tolerance plant.
Okay, so this is a known mechanic for certain substances.
Yeah, it is. And it's actually, this is really interesting. I've never thought about this before. It's actually the same sort of mechanism to get to high intensity hallucinations that you're describing, where somebody is using kava over a period of time. At first, it takes a lot of kava to the point that you are sick to your stomach to get to the point of having hallucinations. Not fun, not enjoyable. You're just out. But if you're using it over a period of time, and you're slowly building that inverse tolerance, you can then get to hallucinogenic states on a much smaller amount of the substance. So I think it's interesting, since both of those are opioid receptor specific. I'd be really curious to know, I've never looked into literature for this, if there's any overlap for that particular category of receptors, even if these two substances, what you have in the kava and salvia, are very different. If there's any pharmacological pathway for that, that's really neat.
In another lifetime, I swear that if I had known where salvia would end up and how transforming it was, I would have like focused my life on doing that, of like figuring out how to isolate and how to compare it. I went a completely different route, but like I feel another timeline of me is absolutely doing that because of how fascinating it is. Another, again, very subjective, kind of like almost supernatural area of salvia that has fascinated me time and time again over the course of decades. Because I mentioned I found this in the late 90s, and I was introducing it to people that I knew over the next 20, 30 years. Like I've continued, and not as much anymore just because it's harder to get unless you're in Georgia like I am right now. But if I go back to Florida, you can't order it online. You got to like, there's all these tapes, because there were some people with, I guess, mental health issues that were already working through. I think the big case was in upstate New York. Some kid did salvia, felt a certain type of way, went into the garage, ran the car in a tent or something, and he expired prematurely by his own devices. And he left a little note that was like, blah, blah, blah. And I think he might have mentioned, salvia showed me, this new way. And that kind of became the catalyst for it being banned everywhere, which now means that there's a very small chance that there's going to be research that connects these different mechanisms in the near future. I don't want to say our lifetime, I want to be optimistic, but it's kind of in the timeout corner right now. Like salvia is thinking about what it did to some kids in upstate New York and all those kids that fell out of windows. So for that reason, it's sort of like a taboo and doesn't go as deep. Like I didn't even know there was a Salvia C before you had just mentioned it. But anyways, the other thing that gets a little bit woo-woo is this constant sighting of Lady Salvia, which is actually Pastora, I think, is one of the indigenous names, and they actually refer to it. And I swear, I mean, you'll have to take my word for it, but I swear that before I even read the Aroid reports, before I even read the Wasson reports, this was a constant theme where somebody like, there's a lady in the room, or there's someone that is either telling me like, come this way, or was almost acting as a gatekeeper. Like, don't go, you're not ready. Don't go through this door. Where did you come from? Go back to where you came from. Very much like a pastor, like someone that was controlling like a flock. And this is something that originally I was like, okay, whatever. I wasn't thinking too much of it because I was still fascinated with like the psychedelic subjective experience. But after the novelty of that wore off, I went in and out of the military. Fun fact, I actually grew salvia outside my barracks room because it was legal.
No way.
I swear to God. In the military, I had little salvia plants. Like I was doing salvia regularly. And that's why I got the tincture, so I could like walk around with it. Anyways, I don't suggest that either. It's probably not legal anymore. It's definitely on their schedule. It might be partly my fault. But even then, after in and out of the military, in and out of other career fields, went and got a big boy job, like in corporate America, like doing normal, like non-teenager novelty stuff. And I would encounter people like, yeah, I'm a psychonaut too. And I'm like, how much of a psychonaut are you? Like, how much do you think you are? Have you ever heard of this thing called salvia? And even like the most chiseled sort of veterans that have like, oh, I do Molly every day or whatever the claim was, I would see the same things, like laughing uncontrollably, sweating, and then, oh my God, there's a lady in the room. Or they would maybe go completely non-vocal. And once they come back to have all these stories about the lady in the room. And at this point, I was very consciously not telling them like, oh, some people see a lady or they call it this. Just like, hey, here's this thing, give them enough context. Hey, you might be disassociated. Hey, here's a nice, couch to lay on. Don't stand up. Don't sit up. If you need anything, let me know. I'll do it. Like all the good babysitter type stuff. And consistently people would be talking about the lady or entities or this concept of, yeah, there was someone there telling me I wasn't ready and to go back. This to me is beyond what you would consider a form constant, which is like these visual patterns that everyone sees honeycombs or everyone sees these geometric patterns because our eyes and our optic nerve kind of are the same in everyone's brain. So it explains why these certain patterns exist. But what about this concept of entities telling you that they're like blocking you or allowing you to go through, or this very specific lady that comes up constantly? Have you found anything to this, or is this just like my own weird subjective bias again?
No, I think across psychedelics, but I found some things specifically with salvia, and even beyond the lady that you're describing. There's even an example of something similar in scientific literature I'll get to in a second. But this idea of the lady in Mazatec lore, this is a pre-Columbian tribe that's always been much more isolated, even during the age of like these Latin American empires, like the Aztec or the Maya. They were much more rural, away from that sort of life. After colonization came with Spanish colonization in Mexico, a lot of these indigenous healers who were using salvia referred to it as the shepherdess, as you said, but particularly connecting it to the Virgin Mary from Christian mythology and lore. And this was interesting because the magic mushrooms that they also used were thought to represent Jesus, hold the spirit of Jesus. And so salvia was supposed to uniquely represent the spirit of the Virgin Mary.
Wow, I've never heard. So we've got like a male and a female aspect of this psychedelic, both coming from the exact same isolated culture.
Yeah, exactly. So
Wow.
so they speak very highly. I'm not an expert on Mazatec religion, but I've spent a lot of time researching this for an article I'm hoping is getting published soon. And one of the things that you do see is this belief that through chewing or taking the tea made out of these leaves, that you can interact with the woman of the plant, the spirit that lives in the plant, which for them is sort of a folk Catholicism mix of the Virgin Mary and pre-Columbian spirit. You will encounter a woman who can help you either in healing or help you identify a problem in your life. It's somebody that you're supposed to convene with, you're supposed to meet. So I think that's really interesting, because I've heard some stories of having a very feminine overtone to psychedelics, or undertone to to salvia in particular. But to hear what you're saying, that there's a lot of different stories, particularly of meeting the woman, the shepherdess, and that this is something that the indigenous people who've used this substance have long said lives in this plant, is really fascinating.
This is those two things, the inverse tolerance for, I guess, like scientific novelty reasons. But now this almost feels going beyond the scientific, unless there's some other deeply ingrained part of our brains that's like organically or mechanically in there that triggers a lady in a certain type of, but even down to the almost having a veil, like when we talk about the Virgin Mary, like the lady tends to also be shrouded or have a veil, or you can't see her face. And again, this isn't my own experience. Like, it was my own experience, but this was after seeing like 30 or 40 people that had never met each other, different walks of life, different locations, different ages, 60-year-olds, 30-year-olds, like all across the gamut. Very similar experiences, which again made this thing stand out so much in my mind. Along with this whole concept of having to pass almost like a test, or that once you get to this, like, I guess you call it like a breakthrough. Once you get through a breakthrough, you almost have a decision to make. Or if you've taken so much, if you've done the elephant killer, you just like blast through that door. The lady's like, wait, you're not ready. And you're just like, like she doesn't even see you. You're not there long enough to converse with her. You're just like a cereal box in outer space at that point. But this also, I think, lends to that inverse tolerance, to, again, once you've like see that there's a lady there, see there's a door there, now if you are crazy enough to do it a second time or a third time or 100th time, whatever, however crazy you are, but now it's almost like, oh, like, okay, there's going to be this like test, or I'm going to be asked. So you almost are able to mentally prepare for what's to come. If you don't mentally prepare first, then I can't even imagine someone on their very first experience making it through all of those stages and having a productive conversation with like the space lady, whoever that ends up being. So this does feel like a labor of love, might not even be the right word, but you'd have to be fascinated by all those first novel, unpleasant experiences, and then be like, wait, there's maybe something more to this. Keep going. It's almost like going to like a psychedelic gym where you're like, it doesn't feel great to feel all these muscle fibers constantly like bursting, and I'm sore and I can't move properly, but I'm going to keep doing this and see if there's anything to it. It very much felt like that, like there was work involved. And for that reason, I think it's probably not recreational. I think recreational is the opposite of what salvia is. I don't know of anyone that's ever done it and then been like, wow, let's go like bring this to a party. Let's go dancing. Or, some people maybe was just to see other people laugh and sweat and see how comfortable they got. But then the novelty wears off.
Yeah. Yeah. And pulling back to what you said where there's not novelty to it. There is novelty to it, but it's not fun. I think there is or even wanting to see your friends like laughing until they can't laugh anymore. I feel like there is some element of a trickster motif to salvia. And this is something that also comes from indigenous tradition around psychedelics as a whole, where there's one study in particular that it's fascinated by, and then a follow-up where multiple people who were given salvia for the study to see how it would affect you if it was vaporized, just right in at a controlled dose. Multiple independent people in these studies said that they were in a carnival.
So, oh my God, man. Yeah. This motif. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, but you've seen people experience that then?
Personally, this was one of the things, like it was literally a carnival. There was a huge colorful like carousel, little entities, and like everyone on the rides and everything were screaming like, come with us, come with us. Like it was very much like this invitational recurring motif that I've had personally, and other people of like, man, I went to like a circus, or I went to a carnival, or I was at Disney World. Like lots of movement and bright colors. Like you're getting stimulated, which is fascinating because you're seeing like these grandiose images, even if you're just in a dark room. And this is so counter to, because usually even on other psychedelics, sometimes the outside light or like the music, you're kind of enhancing it and almost having like synesthesia. And this one, it feels like it's coming from a completely foreign place.
Yeah, and it's well, do you have a lot of experience with DMT?
Not really. Just isolated, and it was just like the crystal form, and a buddy made it from Pinch a Penny pool supply or something. It was like one of those experiences. No guided, but enough. But I think the version that I had experience with is what they used to call like the businessman's high, where you would just like be in and out, and you could go back to work or whatever. But not like a profound experience, kind of just like a fun kaleidoscope that lasted for 15 minutes.
Well, so with DMT, and I have more experience with DMT than I do with most other psychedelics. Terence McKenna, the famous 80s, 90s psychonaut, talked about the motif in psychedelics, high-dose psychedelics, especially DMT, as being that of the carnival or the circus, that it's not recreational. It's not fun. You're not going to a party on this. But it is almost playful, trickstery, like the same way I went to the state fair a few weeks ago. And one of the things I love about the state fair is it's just a rupture of the normal in ways that almost make you uncomfortable. All of these different people you would never interact with in real life are on your body because there's not a ton of room. You're eating weird food. There's all of this noise and color and chaos, but you're still enjoying it. And that's sort of the vibe that I also have gotten from salvia and seen other people describe with salvia, though in a different sense from DMT. Where it is this chaotic playful, chaotic thing that is being broadcast in some people's minds as being that same sort of rupture of the normal that the archetype of the carnival or the circus is, that people independently have without talking to each other about it. And I think that's crazy.
Another pattern that I noticed in my limited experience, but usually people that see that carnival or get that carnival response, it tends to be when they're on the cusp or ready to go to like the breakthrough where it's complete disassociation. Because if you're feeling like I'm at a carnival, my understanding, at least in the context of Salvia, is you haven't done a breakthrough yet, because a carnival requires there to be a planet Earth and for humans to exist. And if you've broken through, none of that exists anymore. Like
Sure.
There's no such thing as a carnival. There's just whatever you're going through. Another, I guess, alternate version of that, the people that aren't ready for that breakthrough, and usually someone's last experience on Salvia, but I'll give one particular example. This was like a high school party very early on, didn't really know all the rules. We're still figuring out what the hell it was, little incense 5X. And just like, crazy house party, hot room with the lights on, loud music. And people are like, let me try it. I heard you got this crazy thing that makes you laugh and sweat, whatever. And one of my really good friends tries it for the first time and goes catatonic for, 5-6 minutes. Like, he's there. He's not dying or anything. He's breathing, but like totally not responsive. He is in a different world. And when he comes back, he just starts crying and he's bummed out. Like the party was great. Horrible experience for him. And I was like, what happened, man? And he described that he was on a school bus, but the school bus was filled with all of his family that he'd ever known, grandparents and aunts and brothers and sisters, like everybody he's ever known was on the school bus. And they weren't laughing at him, but they were all like looking at him, and everyone was telling him your whole life is a lie. And he just went like, that was what his experience was for 5 or 6 straight minutes, was everyone he'd ever met in his family telling him his life was a lie. So understandably, once he comes back to, he's not in a party mood anymore. Like he went into a weird place for like a couple of weeks because he's like, damn, is my life a lie? It completely rocked him. And I've seen similar things happen to people where they're like, never bring that around me again. Like that wasn't fun. I don't like this. And I don't know, I guess there's something in my brain that I want to go back there. I want to be able to ask them like, what about what parts exactly? Can you tell me more? Like I want to interview everyone on the school bus. But that's maybe not everyone's dream experience, I guess, for a Friday night.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So anyways, the point being is that it almost seems that if you're ready to go to that next disassociative level, there's like that playful invitation, like, come on to the carnival, you've got your ticket, you're ready. But if you're not ready for that, it's almost like you get scared away so that you have to really want to come back. And I'm like overly personifying this experience,
sure,
in ways where it's like it's not really like talking to you and trying to coax you into it, but it just feels that way. And when you brought up the carnival as a motif, again, this particular substance being novel and that it binds to your opioid receptors, being that it has this like quick up and down sort of experience where you're back in the sober reality all over again. You might be thinking about shit for a few weeks after that, but you're like back in regular reality, and these recurring themes that pop up in different people. I don't know how else to explain it. I feel like I'm a very skeptical person in general. Like I don't really get into supernatural experiences or explaining things away outside of maybe like chemical interactions. But this has been the thorn in my side since forever. I would almost attribute Salvia for being responsible for at least graduating me from an atheist to an agnostic, and then maybe from like an agnostic to a deist. And we'll see if I can keep like elevating in my Pokemon evolution on all this. But Salvia was the thing. Like with mushrooms and with all the other LSD and DMTs and stuff, those ones and like the group hallucinations all seem like you could at least figure out where they were coming from. Salvia just stands alone in this regard. Yeah.
And that's fascinating. That was the substance that did that for you, because being a minister myself, I'm a Baptist minister, but I'm a cool one, LGBTQ affirming. Don't think the Bible is all historical, yada yada. But what I encounter with people who say, I changed either atheist to agnostic to deist, or into theism is talking about like that overwhelming love, or for that you get on a lot of classical psychedelics. Just, oh, I was overwhelmed by love. I was held by love. I realized there was a being of pure love. But I've also encountered plenty of people who were just like, yeah, just can't explain that. No, there wasn't a ton of love involved.
Yeah, I don't feel that way
this
either.
This is just nuts.
Like, I don't know if, like, for example, MDMA, I don't know if that would make me believe in like a God, just because I understand that this like feeling of nourishment and love can also be triggered by like oxytocin, or there's like chemical explanations for your body going through those feelings and the thoughts. But this is such a specific, complex, like you have to be able to form certain images in your mind and then verbalize them later and have those verbal expressions of visual things that you're seeing and auditory things that you're hearing, and almost like information that you're downloading. I guess that's the key thing, is that Salvia feels like you're getting information that you're receiving from external source, whereas almost every other psychedelic, you feel things and then you kind of interpret those feelings into information. But I mean, there's outliers, right? Didn't the double strand helix technically came from like an LSD trip or something? So some people get these information dumps, but it definitely feels like Salvia is like going to the library and studying for a few hours, as opposed to like riding an actual carnival ride.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm really loving this discussion. Because when I've met lots of people who talk about having these information dumps with other psychedelics. I met somebody who said that he had met Jesus, and Jesus like told him about the Gnostic Gospels of Philip and Thomas. And this guy was like, those don't exist. You don't know what you're talking about, yada, yada, yada. And after the trip, found out that those Gnostic Gospels do actually exist. But the way I've sort of been able to hold like the psychedelics might do something here, really do something. I've really felt with Salvia that sense of like the veil being pulled back into something else, very sacred, in ways that other psychedelics haven't done that for me. But being able to hold it for me has been really just thinking about dreams and the way that ancient people used to handle dreams, where, you know, we all go to bed at night and have these nightly hallucinations that we've kind of just decided, you know, just brain doing weird brain things. But lots of people have described throughout history and in a contemporary form, having dreams so intense, it's like they're in real life, and it's bizarre and it's strange, and it changes them. They decide to change careers or change the way that they live their lives or parts of their personality. And being able to hold that, like, maybe something else is going on here, but also maybe it's just a drug. Being able to hold both of those at the same time, the same way that a lot of cultures have done with dreams for years. Yeah, maybe it's the gods, maybe it's the spirits, or maybe you just had some bad food. Being able to hold both of those, being skeptical and open-minded at the same time, is difficult to do. But I think it's the only way to explore these things without going just absolutely batshit.
So since this seems to be like your area anyways, I want to recommend two or three different books or like areas that, if you haven't heard, let me know if you haven't heard of these, or if you have. These ones are kind of equal in fascination. So one of them is a book from like the 1690s, and it's called A Voyage into the World of Cartesius, or like the Cartesian Voyage. And I forgive you if you haven't heard of this, because I dug this thing out from like the depths. I didn't see anyone doing book reviews on it on any platform, but I found it through, I'll give you the short story. I found it through a weird article in like the 80s that talked about this group of men that were eating pineal glands and like having psychedelic visions off of them or something. And it was like, that's weird. And then I found that was a reference to an even older newspaper article from like the 1800s that didn't say anything about eating pineal glands, but it said that something related to the pineal gland, and that they were ingesting psychedelics and that they could live the lives of other people. I was like, what the hell is this? And I keep rewinding this back until I found the original source, and it was this book from the 1690s. And the whole premise of this book, I believe it was a very tongue-in-cheek explanation of deep Rosicrucian and like very high-level theological, philosophical ideas, but it took place with the protagonist being Rene Descartes, and Rene Descartes was known to have narcolepsy, I believe. He would like pass out in front of people and stuff. But this book was explaining that really he had some sort of DMT substance. They didn't name it as DMT because this was in the 1690s the book was written, but it was some Chinese herb that would cause you to go catatonic and see visions and get information from these other worlds. And I'm reading this, I'm like, this has got to be DMT or some sort of analog to DMT that we're talking about here. There's plants that, but the description was that Rene Descartes would do this snuff. He would become catatonic for like, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or something, maybe in the car, sometimes hours. But when he came back, he would describe of being out into the universe and getting direct lessons about how the universe was constructed, how like this Rosicrucian concepts of matter and dust and like plasma and vortices, like vortex math. He would come back from these astral travels and have all this information and dump it on everyone, and was kept explaining that this was the way that he was coming up with these new ideas and bring it back. Now, I think the book itself was just a vehicle to explain some of this Rosicrucianism, but it shows that people were clearly aware of this concept of taking a psychedelic and getting information from external source and bringing it back. There was another one that's not DMT. This is actually nitrous related. And I don't know, does nitrous come into your purview of when you talk about like psychedelic and theology, or is it in its own category?
I think it fits just in the dissociative hallucinogen category. So it kind of does its own thing, but still has had a lot of impact on people.
So here's another one that I do think that you might be interested in. I think the guy, I always get his name wrong. It's either Paul Benjamin Blood or it's Benjamin Paul Blood. People that have two first names as middle and first name, it gets dicey. But this guy Blood, he was in his 40s, I think, his late 40s. He went to go get a tooth extraction, was not like an alcoholic. He was just like a poet and kind of a researcher, like a normal guy. He gets a tooth extraction, and on the way back, I don't know how strong the nitrous was back then, but apparently as he walked back to the house, he was still feeling it. And by the time he got home, it had completely sort of evaporated. But he had this profound realization that on his walk home, he understood Hegelian philosophy, which was something that he had struggled with his entire life. And for whatever reason, it just like, it clicked. It was like he was in the jazz group and he just like fit right into like the improvisational sort of like flow that was going on. But it got frustrated because once so anyways, he starts going back to the dentist and eventually just gets hooked up on his own supply of nitrous and spends the next like 10 or 20 years of his life kind of doing what we're describing here, but just nitrous. He just would get super blasted on nitrous and then try and contemplate philosophy. And over time, he developed, and I think it was called the anesthetic revelation of philosophy, something like this. But he basically has this theory that you are able to talk to some higher type of intelligence and bring information back, but it's so overwhelming. The information is so deep and complex that it can't like cross this barrier without losing most of it. And even in that Cartesian Voyage book, they describe something similar. They do it in a little more illustrative way, but he mentions that he was given like a scroll or a book, but when he's in this astral realm and he tries to fly back through the house into his body, the house like blocks the book from coming in because the book is like this tangible physical thing and he's in an astral form. I take this as a metaphor in a way, but Paul Benjamin Blood describes it the same way. But he was like, you have all this information and it's almost like as you're sobering up, you can see it just dissolving from your hands, but you can grab like tiny little bits of it. If you hold them really tight, you can bring them back. And his idea was, well, if you keep just going there over and over, maybe I can bring it back mustard seed at a time, and eventually I'll have something to build on. He didn't have a whole lot to build on other than this idea that you can bring it back. But this is another fascinating topic in psychedelics that's way outside of the inebriation and the euphoria thing of like getting information. This is almost like a struggle. This is turning it into a job or into work, like a frustrating experience to keep wanting to go back and do all of this.
Well, have you, I have not heard of those two sources. I'm going to look them up because both of those are fascinating. I
You would
want to
particularly like the
understand.
Cartesian one because that was also
Yeah.
based on like a Jesuit like it has heavy like theological context to it.
I'm going to check that. I'm going to check that out. I wrote it down to look it up later. Are you familiar with DMTX, the program, the research
Mm,
program?
No.
So one of the things with DMT is that, and I think this is like the setup to a bad horror movie. One of the things with DMT is that you don't build a tolerance to it. You can continually stay in that space if you have an intravenous DMT drip. So at University of New Mexico with Rick Strassman, who wrote DMT and the Soul of Prophecy and DMT, the Spirit Molecule, he was doing this just right in the arm, right to the brain. And because it doesn't have a tolerance, you can stay there for hours in this deep DMT state. So going back to like Timothy Leary in the 60s and 70s, they were looking for ways to stay in this deep psychedelic trip for as long as possible, become used to being in this deep trip, and come out of it just enough to write down what you can or communicate what you can, and then they'll turn it back and you'll go in again. So they're talking about it literally being a psychonaut, like being an astronaut, getting trained to go deep in the DMT realm for hours and hours at a time. And I don't know how well that'll work. And I also think it sounds like the setup for a bad horror movie.
This is altered states, what we're describing right now.
Right,
which
exactly.
is based on John C. Lilly's work, which is kind of Timothy Leary with dolphins.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is where people are sort of going at this point with psychedelics. I'm a little bit more cautious in that I think it should be kept mysterious. We shouldn't play with things that we don't understand quite yet. But there are people funding and looking for creating programs to go deep into psychedelic realms for extended periods of time to try to wire back exactly what goes on in there, which is just crazy.
I feel like I missed my calling. That absolutely sounds like a career field that I would opt into if it were something that didn't seem like you could end up in federal prison on the way to like studying to get there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned something else earlier too, and I guess for like a point counterpoint thing, like I'm interested in your take on this, I guess, subjective area. But you mentioned that you haven't actually smoked salvia before, and that specifically you use like the loose leaves in the mouth, not just because it's traditional, but almost like that's how it's seen as like respectful. And I've also talked to recently a guy named Sam Believe who runs an ayahuasca retreat in South America, like I think the most successful one. And he had similar things about that some people will do like a DMT vape pen, or they'll do the penny, supply. Like I got introduced to it. Someone ordered mimosa bark online or something and does it in their garage. But that those aren't like the respectful ways of doing this. Aside from that, you want to have all the other elements to it and a guide and set and setting and even just a non-isolate. The same, I guess, a good analogy too is like the medical marijuana field. Once that started getting advanced, now all of a sudden people care about terpenes and this entourage effect, and it's not just the THC. Maybe it's the CBD and the CBG and the CBC and like the limonene. Like all these different things together have a different effect than each of them sort of isolated on their own. So I acknowledge that, and I'm almost assuming it's probably the same if you were to do just Salverin A or just Salverin B or C. Like you probably want the whole effect. So that acknowledgement out of the way, that like, yeah, you want the whole plant sort of effect because that's how tradition was done. But the respect angle, I almost feel like I'm intentionally disrespectful sometimes. If someone's like, oh, the ancients in Mazatec, they would want you to only do the loose leaves. Like, give me that 600X. I'll show them wrong right now. Like, but I wonder, do you think that there's a possibility that I'm actually angering some ancient spirit? Like, am I actually causing an egregious or like causing a bad first impression on some astral deity unbeknownst to me just out of this knee reaction? Because, and to explain, I guess part of my other thinking is that how fair is it that this one tiny area on the entire planet, gets to have salvia and no one else gets it? And it's almost like like finders keepers, just because it was found in this region and this culture developed around it, and they decided what's the respectful use and what's not. Don't make extracts, do it orally only. Is that just convenient because geographically they happen to be the first one that found it? What if the conquistadors came and they found it before the Mazatec found it? Do they get to set what's respectful and what's not? Or is there like an inherent respect in using some of these?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is something I've been wrestling with for a while. There's a great anarchist greenhouse in Maine that sells salvia plants legally only to the states where it's legal because it's not federally scheduled.
And you can't really grow them from seed, from what I understand. Like you almost have to grow them from clones.
Yeah, you have to grow it from clones. It's really, really difficult to do. But they donate all of the money made off selling these to a Mazatec culture and language charity, a nonprofit, to protect the Mazatec people. And my sort of view on this, because people ask, well, why would you treat salvia differently than you treat like magic mushrooms? Right. And my sort of feeling on that is that like DMT or magic mushrooms, this is something that's found all over the world. This is almost every single continent has naturally occurring magic mushrooms on it, in that it's not geographically condensed. Same with DMT, that it's in virtually every living thing, that comes from the same amino acid that turns into melatonin to help you sleep, comes from the same amino acid that turns into serotonin, can turn into DMT if it's metabolized right. But salvia particularly comes from this Mazatec Valley or the Mazatec people in the Oaxaca Valley of Mexico. And so my kind of view of that is, one, the Mazatec people have been horrifically oppressed and genocided over an extended period of time. I was reading some of the early history, the stuff that Wasson doesn't put into his stories, where dozens of Mazatec villages were completely washed out to make room for a dam to sort of industrialize the area. There were multiple massacres. When magic mushrooms in particular became very popular in Huautla de Jimenez, which is a village in Oaxaca with a lot of Mazatec people, there was sexual harassment, there were assaults, there was this treatment that the Mazatec people are just these primitive savages, and we, the great researchers, can take one of the only things that they have that we have not already taken from them. And so for me, one of my primary values in life is on justice and on standing with people who've experienced a lot of injustice. And so I think it actually is very possible that by continuing in the commercial exploitation or cultural exploitation of this small group of people who have already suffered so much, that, yeah, we might be angering something bigger than ourselves, actually. But I also think for me, it's also a form of reparation, that we're giving back to people who have done so much for us. If it wasn't for the people, Maria Sabina, who is a Mazatec shaman there in the area, we may have never had a psychedelic revolution if she hadn't agreed to do this ritual with R. Gordon Wasson. So we owe the Mazatec people a lot for how much they've given to our ability to expand our own minds. And this, to me, is just a small way of being able to give back respect to their culture, give back money to their culture, and just express my gratitude for how much they really have made it possible for me to expand my own spiritual and inner life.
A phenomenal response to that, and that's a great point that I haven't considered, that almost every other psychedelic known to man can be found or developed in a lot of other areas, whereas salvia miraculously, even Wasson, I think, notes this in his research papers, that when the Spanish explorers came, they absolutely decimated these people. They found the marijuana plants and the mushrooms, and they got rid of all of it. It was basically tickets straight to hell. Like, why would you want to talk to Satan? We're going to get rid of all this. But somehow they overlooked or weren't aware of salvia, or maybe the Mazatec people knew how important it was to keep it sort of secret. So they just weren't aware that it was something that they also probably would have stomped out. And if they had stomped out salvia at that point, it might have just disappeared from the planet and never been known to anyone outside of the shamans that had used it for generations. But I think that also another counterpoint to my my sort of unapologetic endorsement of capitalism and commercialism, that the silver lining here is that without 14-year-old me ordering, like literal ounces and pounds of salvia to, the suburbs in the early 90s, that it could have also disappeared just being irrelevant. And that if it weren't for the psychonaut and the commercialized and the widespread aspect, like someone in Australia or Canada or anywhere else in the world not even know that this thing exists, let alone have the ability to try it. So I don't know. I feel like there's good and bad of this. Clearly, at some point in the future, the Mazatec will probably just be like an echo its former self, propped up because of all the contributions that they've made and like the reparations they're getting from it. But if it had not been commercialized, I don't know if the same could still be said.
Yeah, I just, particularly when it comes to things as powerful as these substances, right now, the U.S. government is planning to use MDMA and DMT and psilocybin and all these substances, not just to treat PTSD for veterans, which I think is very important, but also as a means to help, quote, integrate new recruits into the military.
This is new to me. I haven't heard this before now.
This has been a shift that you've seen with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, the research that they're doing that's funded at a federal level for how psychedelics can be used in the military. People really struggle, obviously, when they first come into the military. The rigor, the change in what civilian life and military life is. I come from a military family. I've heard these stories before. And so the idea is, well, what if all of the love and joy you felt on MDMA was associated with the new place you've come to call home, the U.S. military? And those are the sorts of things for me that I just wonder, does the ends getting psychedelics to be more widely accepted, getting these substances to be out and used to expand our own minds? I don't know if sometimes that justifies the means where we could actually, the long game of being able to use these substances freely, decriminalized, in safe settings, that we have the freedom. Well, we're all going to be super soldiers. I think whether it's the way that salvia was sent out with the in head shops and stuff like that, or MDMA and psilocybin DMT being used for military application, I think it really does affect the way we use these substances, the way we see these substances, depending on how we're getting them into the public sphere. And I do wish that when it came to salvia, when I got my salvia plant, which is for decorative purposes only, from this Maine greenhouse, it sent me a nice sheet that looked at, here's how, thank you for buying this. We worked with a consultant. Here's how you use it. If it's legal in your state, this is how you take it, blah, blah, blah. But it was a way that simultaneously I could cheaply and easily get this incredible plant and at the same time be able to support and be part of a community that was giving me millennium of wisdom on how to use this plant, on how to respect this plant. And I think we can do both. And in the long term, I think maybe if it had gone that route instead of the head shop route, maybe it wouldn't have had the moral outrage or the social media outrage or any of that ended up getting it suppressed if it took a different route. So I think there's this sort of spiritual, moral, for me anyways, very spiritual, moral side of it. But I think there's just the very practical side that I don't want the government telling me this is how you must use these substances, and I also don't like the government telling me what I can and can't do with my own mind.
It's a good point. I guess my most practical thinking is the reason it came through the head shops was sort of like you described earlier too, that you might see a bag of K2 right next to a bag of salvia in certain places because both of them are seen as legal highs. Like, here's a way that you can, go and party without getting pulled over and sent to jail for it, versus this other plant that is illegal for you to own and possess depending on the state or whatever. So that novelty, but the main thing for me, I guess K2 included, is that, again, growing up with like wizard weed in the back of High Times and all these inert plants that looked cool but didn't do anything at all for you, like smoking banana peels and eating nutmeg, which I did, by the way, and it does work, but it sucks. I don't recommend it. I ate like a whole thing of nutmeg. But the most of the experience that people had, like, you would get suckered one time. You'd get wizard weed one time and be like, okay, I'm an idiot. Of course it doesn't do anything. Of course that's why it's legal. So then when Salvi comes along and it's like, oh yeah, great, another legal high, and someone tries it and they're like, oh my God, I never want to do that again. That was intense. Like, that was like, I had a tangible effect. You didn't have to convince yourself. I think I kind of feel weird. Do you guys feel weird? There's none of that ramp up. You're just like, I am a wall, and then you come back. And I think that's probably the only reason they got spread around, is because they're like, someone was like, hey, have you tried this legal high? Oh yeah, of course. None of those work. And it's like, no, you haven't tried this one. And that's kind of what breaks it through. And I don't know if it would have had the same effect on people like, hey, like, let's keep this really sacred. And it's a very intense, introspective experience. I think what made it popular was, this will make you jump out your window. Like, this will make you like flail around and hit somebody and break things that you can put on Vine. And it's almost like a double-edged sword, that its popularity might end up saving it, but also gave it this horrible look. And I think it's ironic. I had never heard about using psychedelics to integrate people into the military. When I was at Disney, we actually did a whole bunch of PTSD training and stuff. And a lot of the resources that were coming in were using psychedelics, specifically MDMA and psilocybin, in order to help transition people that had been through trauma and like reintegrate them into life. Essentially, I think if I go back to my skeptical, like biological, neurological explanation, because it enhances neuroplasticity and it enhances new neural pathways to be formed. This might also be one of the explanations for this culture of microdosing, is that you're kind of making sure that on a neurological level, you constantly remain open to new connections and new patterns being formed, versus being kind of closed off and selling into patterns. So I can understand that version of it, but there's also this idea of integrating into the military. And the irony is that originally psychedelics being used by the military was to induce this, like, the trauma, like they were using it to create the trauma and then instill the programming. And then at some point someone was like, wait, we can undo trauma too? This is crazy. Let's start doing this. And then a guy in the back of the room was like, wait a minute, like, we can kill more people doing this. And this almost reminds me of The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is a movie turned book by Ron Johnson. Or
one
John
of my
Ronson,
dad's favorites. Yeah.
And that also was the same, I think, premise in a vague level. I think Project Phoenix, I might have that wrong, but that they realize in Vietnam, and I'm just summarizing parts of the movie, but that even if they were trained to use a gun, when they were like, okay, shoot all those guys across the field from you, a bunch of people would like intentionally, maybe like unconsciously miss because they didn't have that killer instinct. And a guy ends up doing a whole bunch of acid and gets into like the free love movement and Star Wars Jedi mind tricks. And instead of like, we are all one, it's like, no, we are all one. And because of that, we can teach people to shoot. Like, we can teach people to kill on sight, because we'll get them into this completely other zone where it's like, don't worry, you're just taking out another aspect of yourself. That's just another, experience of God. And that experience of God over there wants to know what it's like to get shot right now. So it's kind of, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's always the military's end goal. Like this, it was a wake-up call, but my first day into like actual training out of boot camp, and everyone was telling me constantly, no matter what training I was going through, was like, this is the Air Force, but the whole point for us to exist is to kill people and break their things. Like whatever the humanitarian aid and defense, all of that, forget that. Your job from now until you leave is to kill people and break their things. Everything else leads to that. And this is sort of why I guess I would be scared of the military being the one that embraces psychedelics. So let me segue this a little bit to Wasson, because I mentioned before he'd come back up. Wasson is a name I only heard of because of Salvia Divinorum research. I wanted to know what this 5x incense stuff was, and every single paper that seemed to have any insight was by this guy, Wasson. Who the hell is Wasson? I didn't realize who Wasson was until like 2 decades later, through, I guess, like conspiratorial research. They're making these claims of the CIA is the one that introduced psychedelics and started the psychedelic revolution, which seems far-fetched on the outskirts. But once you learn about all of this, and then I was shocked to realize that this Wasson guy was the VP of JP Morgan Bank. He was like a close personal friend of JP Morgan. He was a member of the Century Club. If you don't know what that is, I forgive you. It was a very elite, private, secret society, but kind of like a private social club in New York that a bunch of movers and shakers were members of. He was also very close friends with a guy named Henry Luce, who ran Time Life magazine. Henry Luce was a Skull and Bones member, which is also a very highly coveted secret society out of Yale. But if it weren't for all of those pieces in play, if it weren't for Wasson working as VP for JP Morgan Bank, if it weren't for him being a member of the Century Club and his connection to Luce via the Century Club, there also might not have been a psychedelic revolution, because the sequence of events, as I understand it, Wasson becomes fascinated with mushrooms because his wife, I think her name was Marina, his wife, they go out into the woods and she starts picking mushrooms willy-nilly and like eating them. And he starts freaking out because, as he writes in his book later, that the Western world had like 5 names for mushrooms and like 4 out of the 5 all indicated poison. Yeah. So if it weren't like just a typical button mushroom or so like an oyster mushroom, maybe if you got really exotic, it was poison and you should stay away from mushrooms. They will kill you. And she was like, that's crazy. Like I eat 40 different types of mushrooms. This is part of a normal diet. No one thinks like this where I'm from, basically like Russia, I believe. Yeah. And this kind of sets him down this path. Like, why am I afraid of mushrooms? Why did I freak out on her thinking she was going to die if she ate these? So he starts on this journey that's funded by JP Morgan, by maybe the CIA in some capacity. And he finds Maria Sabina, right? And she's the one that gives him these traditional sort of rituals. He gets introduced to magic mushrooms. He gets introduced to Salvia Divinorum. He brings this information back with him, tells Henry Luce about it. Henry Luce publishes it. And I guess Henry Luce technically is the one that calls it magic mushrooms. I think, in fact, Wasson and his wife were like, please don't. Let's not sell this as a magic mushroom to all these housewives. They're going to be reading Reader's Digest and Life magazine. Henry Luce does it anyway. Henry Luce becomes such a strong advocate of psychedelics. He encourages his employees to all do acid, to all take mushrooms, to try all of these things. So he's pushing it in like this corporate world. And then at the same time, LSD being obtained by the military, the US government bought the entire world supply, I believe, at one point in like the late 50s. And it starts making its way through all of these high-level military installations and then into Hollywood, which has a reason for it. I won't go down the explanation there, but here you've got psychedelic movement literally coming from Skull and Bones and coming from the military and coming from Hollywood and all pushing it on the rest of the country. So I know a lot of people that are now skeptical of psychedelics, period, just as an umbrella, because it's this big military psyop to do who knows what. So you're the first one that gave me an answer to that. The who knows what is because maybe they can train you to be a super soldier. Maybe you won't resist the draft if they give you a huge, hit of like magic mushrooms first, and then they're like, sign this paper.
Yeah, well, it's when you're getting into the military and a lot of neo-Nazis and white supremacists and those sorts of groups use psychedelics at this stage. I wrote a fun's the wrong word, difficult paper about that a few years ago.
Really? Not tripping Nazis? That sounds like an awesome paper.
Yeah, there was an easy read is Lucy in the Sky with Nazis. That if you Google it online, it's not my paper, but it's the first one that introduced me to this idea.
Okay.
But the idea is kind of what you're saying, where what you were saying with the men who stare at goats, where you get this idea in your mind of, oh well, it's bringing you back in touch with love and with connection and with the oneness of the universe, and it's turned into this like, yes, love for your country, love for your particular racial group, connection to your commanding officer, those sorts of things, where these good and normal things that human beings do, have love, have connection, are weaponized to make people fall in line, which is terrible. But I will say, you're with Wasson and the CIA connection, we do have one document where Wasson, somebody who went with Wasson on one of his trips to Maria Sabina, was a CIA operative who was being paid by the CIA. And the missionaries, the connection that's really rarely noted is that Wasson first contacted a missionary named Eunice Pike, who lived in the area and was trying to translate the Bible to Mazatec. She was part of something called Wycliffe Bible Translators, or Summer Institute of Linguistics. They later also were exposed for having possible ties to the CIA. And were kicked out of a number of countries as a result. So
when you say possible ties, I hear that as a CIA front group, like a laundering front.
More, it's sort of like this. The CIA hates communists. Wycliffe Bible Translator hates communists and Catholics. Which are connected with communism in some of these countries. And so anybody who's lightly left of thinking that Catholics should be hunted for sport are then working with this mission group is working with the CIA. And so there's not a ton of hard evidence that Wycliffe did this, but there's enough connections there that have been published in different books that it would be utterly unsurprising if new data did come out confirming this. And tying that in with the fact that there was a CIA operative in this area with Wasson while he met with Maria Sabina, so that a Wycliffe Bible translator could translate the recording he did of this particular magic mushroom session. I just think the connections there are so wild. The U.S. clearly wanted military application from early on, and particularly military application to see if they could create allies where they previously didn't have any through chemical manipulation, which is insane.
The Nazi connection too. I mean, another instance of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, were like the Vatican rat lines, right? Where they're like, well, it's better than communism. Maybe you're not doing what we want, but it's better than being godless. Like, God forbid you be godless. So here's an escape route. That was another instance of that. Also, the CIA connection. Wasson is named, I think, in the JFK reports. So he was tangential to a lot of people involved. I believe he was close personal friends of the Dulles brothers, that ended up being director of the CIA and everything. CIA. So yeah, there's so many deep connections with Wasson and the CIA and the psychedelic movement that I don't know how to ever parse it all. I don't know if it's a good thing, a bad thing, it doesn't seem like it's a coincidence. I'm a little bit too conspiratorial to believe in that regard, but it does seem that there was like an intentional release of this information to the public for who knows what the hell reason. So to get away a little bit from Salvia in particular, and I guess just more into psychedelics and specifically theology more, because when we first started talking, you were like, well, I'm not just a Salvia enthusiast. Actually, you're like a Baptist minister that specializes in psychedelic theology. And my mind immediately goes to the sacred mushroom and the cross, which I assume that you've read a few times or familiar with, John Allegro.
Yeah.
The premise being, in my bumpkin simplified version, but the premise being, I've interpreted it, is that some point in the past, and this also is based on The Road to Persephone, I think, which is another Gordon Wasson book that he co-wrote. And there's also like Food of the Gods or something that he wrote with Hoffman, but the idea was that maybe the original Eucharist wasn't unleavened bread. It wasn't like this little piece of cracker that you break in half and hand out to people, but that this might have been a magic mushroom or an Amanita muscaria or some type of a psychedelic, so that when you went to Mass and ate the body of Christ, you were actually having a real psychedelic religious experience from that. And he also goes on to cite that the Amanita muscaria mushroom in the wild, they show up after it rains, and then in the sunlight, it will turn into like a gold color. The cup will sort of invert itself. The rainwater will soak up the red pigment on the top. It looks like a golden chalice with blood inside of it. So now you've got these motifs for the holy blood and the holy grail, all kind of linking back to mushrooms. Santa's a mushroom, Jesus is a mushroom, Voodoo's a mushroom. How much of this do you believe? Do you think this is just like oversimplifications? Is it blasphemy to say Jesus was a mushroom?
You know, my take on I wrote a paper on this too because I was fascinated by this book. My take on this is that he was actually writing this book. Allegro was writing this book as a purposeful troll. He was writing this as a purposeful troll to get back at some of his colleagues who had mistreated him and he believed were too firmly entrenched in this liberal Christian tradition. It's because he lays little Easter eggs throughout the book where liberal Christian theologians would say during this period, would say something like, well, you know, maybe Jesus didn't do this or didn't do that, or wasn't the Son of God this, or wasn't, you know, didn't rise from the dead that. But there are good moral lessons in the Bible that we should grab onto. And throughout this book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, Allegro makes a very similar argument that, you know, the historical Jesus, you know, wasn't God. There was actually no historical Jesus. He's this mushroom allegory that for the Muscaria mushroom. And so we can take good moral lessons from the Bible, but, you know, it's ultimately misunderstood mythology. But the last chapter of his book is super interesting. He has this section where he kind of asks, why would it bother you if Jesus was a mushroom, if all that matters is the moral teaching? Or are you being a hypocrite and secretly do care about what happened in the past, and the idea that it would be something you think blasphemous upsets you? So I think this was something that his argumentation, I think, throughout is bunk. I think he was way smarter than he comes off in the book even. He knew what he was doing, and he pulled off what I think is an elaborate hoax to poke fun at all of the people who looked down on him. And it sparked another path in his career. But yeah, that's sort of my take on it. And you have to really look between the lines to see what he's getting at.
I've never heard this take on Allegro before. This might be way niche, but there's also something similar in the world of Freemasonry. There was a guy, Leo Taxel, that wrote something called The Secrets of Masonry, which was this expose in the late 1890s. But he was essentially a critic of Freemasons and of the Vatican. He was basically an atheist. He wrote political satire. He was kind of edgelord. He was like a Twitter edgelord, spreading memes and getting like 20 million clicks on everything. But he also intentionally was like, I'm going to pit these two groups against each other that already have some sort of public distrust and inherent distrust within their own ranks. So he does this and eventually comes out and admits, like, haha, gotcha. It was all me. I made this all up just to get you guys mad at each other. But still 100 years later, his original satirical hoaxed work that he came out and said, haha, I did this all to just like get you guys mad. People still cite it now as fact and build upon it as if it were this reference book that you can like expand on, as opposed to like a funny inside joke that he was trolling the entire world with. So that being applied to Allegro, it hurts me a little bit, but I relate that it does seem maybe simplistic compared to what Allegro was capable of doing with his research. Yeah. This was like the Time Life magazine magic mushroom version of what. So do you think that it was all disingenuous? Do you think there's any part of Allegro that thought that Jesus really could have been a mushroom, or was the entire thing just to rile people up?
I don't know. That's a good question. He had a history. He had a history of telling tall tales out of scant evidence during a lot of his Dead Sea Scrolls research. But one of the things that's in the background of Allegro's life that people don't often realize is that he was originally a Methodist minister. And as he was going through seminary, he learned that, like, the Gospels aren't historical documents. There's a lot of it that's mythology. That Moses didn't write the Torah. A lot of those things didn't happen. And he was really, from a young age, in his 20s, he was really, what's the word I'm looking for? Disenchanted with the way that he felt like he had been lied to. He felt like he was being sold this one myth, but behind the scenes, everybody knew the truth of that these weren't really historical stories. And so I think he got fired. Before he wrote this book, he was getting fired. He was losing friends. He was just sort of on an anti-Christian campaign in a lot of ways because he had been hurt. And I really think maybe there was some part of him that thought some parts of this serious. But I really think he was trying to make people within the church feel that had made him feel this way, make them feel this way. And that's sort of more what he was getting at by writing this big trolling book.
It's interesting to hear this, because I guess my experience with it would have been the opposite. It was almost like, oh wow, maybe there is something more to all this like Christian lore. Maybe like he is a mushroom. Okay, now I'm interested again. Now I've got a little bit more respect again, because I went from atheist, agnostic, deist. I don't know where I'm at anymore. I'm just a skeptical, weird, like neo-Gnostic goober in some ways, I guess. Okay, so yeah, Allegro as a troll, I'll have to integrate that into my understanding of him now too, because I guess outside of his C scroll and just really being into the idea that he came up with, what about Santa? Is Santa the same thing? Is Santa a troll? Do you think Santa could have been a mushroom?
I have absolutely no idea. I haven't looked enough into this topic. I think it's perfectly plausible. I don't think we have enough. I haven't seen enough data to really know one way or another.
Okay, it's a highly contested. It's fairly controversial when it comes up. And I guess to tack onto that too, in one of Wasson's books, I think it was Rhoda Persephone, he mentions that there's all these ancient medieval depictions of these like supernatural beings, like guys with a big foot, like a big parasol, I think they call it. He had like a foot that would block the sun out, and there was a guy with like his face was in his body, kind of like one of those Real Monsters characters.
Oh, yeah.
Right? There's all these different iterations, and his interpretation also was that they were all mushrooms. These were all just like alchemical proxies to talk about psychedelic mushrooms, which might have still been taboo. He even goes to make pretty big claims that stoma was a muscaria mushroom, and that even Buddha and the entire basis of Buddhism might have also been all around the use of psychedelic mushrooms, but that, like him, he related that, I guess, in certain Buddhist cultures, I think they still ate mushrooms, but certain types of mushrooms were like taboo, off limits. You don't talk about it, you don't write about it, you definitely don't eat it or anything, because Buddha ends up dying from being served the poisonous mushroom. That's how he got taken out. But he was constantly pointing at that all of these religious sort of cults that what they started out as might have all just kind of been like drug dens that kind of exploded in popularity over time, but because of the taboo nature, that sort of gets covered up. So I don't know if he was also CIA plant, and he's not trolling, but he's like planting the same thing that Allegro did, because also there was a lot of CIA involvement in interpreting Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff. It's kind of crazy. It's crazy all the overlap here.
Yeah, I really one of my favorite sources on Buddhism and magic mushrooms. Did you see a little while back where one of the people from Biden's cabinet that went to visit China accidentally ate magic mushrooms?
No,
But they
what?
but they had been cooked, and psilocybin breaks down at like
Right.
110 degrees, very low temperature. So it was this big news story that they had. They didn't say it was magic mushrooms in like the story. They just gave like it's a psilocybe genus mushroom. I looked at that. I was like, now these are magic mushrooms. So it was used in a culinary way for some Buddhists. There's a couple of older medicinal books on medicinal Chinese medicine with Buddhists who refer to magic mushrooms as the laughing mushroom, where if you take it, you see demons, you laugh a ton. They say it's a little bit uncomfortable, but they don't have it be a spiritual thing one way or the other. So I think there's a big wide world of substance use and the possibilities for that in religion. Buddhism, one of the precepts of Buddhism is that you shouldn't take drugs, and yet sometimes you do. In Islam, it's the same thing. You can't get intoxicated, but Muslims chew khat, which is a amphetamine out of Africa, or opium was smoked, hash being smoked. So yeah, there's all sorts. There's a whole different range of ways that religions have used drugs over time. That's usually a little more open than people realize.
All right, I'm going to start wrapping this up because I know that we can go on for hours and hours on this. So last question before we get into another little segment here. And I just want, I guess, your opinion or any research or thoughts that you've gone over on a claim that I hear often enough that I'm asking the question about it, but that these entities that you encounter on a psychedelic trip or one of these experiences, there's a lot of concern that people are literally conversing with demons, that they are now interacting with some sort of nefarious pagan or just like a demonic entity, maybe even in the classical Greek sense of like a daemon versus a demon, but that either way, interacting with them can like cause all sorts of like problems for you in your waking life. Have you been over any of these different sort of ideas, and where are you at now? Like, if I do DMT today and I talk to an entity, did I just talk to Satan?
That's a good question, and it's one that, being that I'm a Baptist preacher living in this world, I get all the time. I get messages about it all the time. And one of the big principles that we find from the Gospel of Matthew is that good trees give good fruit. You can tell whether something is good or bad based on the effects that it causes.
Well,
and so
salvia might break that mold a little bit, though.
Well, right. I think it might break that. Well, it might break that mold a little bit. But if we're talking about again, this is part of why I pull back to the traditional medicinal use in Mazatec culture. When you're using something in a responsible manner, a healthy manner, in a way that for most psychedelics, where you're talking about like machine elves or entities or whatever, like high dose LSD or psilocybin, DMT in general, the idea is that you can test these spirits, you can test what you're interacting with, what sort of rituals you're engaging with, based on the effects that they have. And I mean, medicinally, we don't have a lot of information on salvia, but for psychedelics as a whole, incredible medicinal application, incredible anti-suicide, anti-depression, anti-anxiety, treating PTSD. So for me, I have a lot of trouble. Jesus says that you can't can't tear down your own house. Someone won't tear down their own house. And I think that in general, I think God's in the business of healing, and that's not really something demons do. And so if you're encountering these beings on substances that are known for their healing properties, I don't really think it can be a demon, because you can't be healed by something that's evil. That's my opinion on it.
Very controversial opinion. No matter what your response was, it would have been a controversial opinion to somebody, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got a final little segment, which I'll get a litmus test from you on a whole bunch of other things, kind of similar to that last question. Let me just play the clip first, and then I'll explain how it works.
Okay.
Hey, conspiracy buffs, I double dare you to take some PCP, the Paranormal Conspiracy Probe. On your marks, get set, and go!
Okay, really simple. I'm just going to say a phrase, and I just want you to give me a score from 1 to 10, how much you agree with that phrase, how much you believe in it. So, for example, The one that I always start out with is Bigfoot. How much do you believe in Bigfoot on a scale from 1 to 10?
Solid 5.
Okay, fair point. So you can be swayed either way, you're on the fence.
I can see swayed either way.
How about the concept of flat Earth, that we are living on some sort of a flat plane and not a sphere or a globe?
It'd have to be a 1 for me.
Okay. How about and listen closely because there's qualifiers in here.
Okay.
That a human being has stepped foot on the moon sometime in the last 100 years. How true would you say that is on a scale from 1 to 10?
I'd probably say an 8.
Okay. Now let's be more specific and say that NASA put somebody on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission. How much would you agree with that statement?
I think a lot of the data comes from the same time period, so it still would probably be an 8.
Okay. And then what about the possibility that the military hired Stanley Kubrick to make a B-roll backup of the moon landing just as a safety precaution, safety net?
You know, I think that's pretty likely. I'll give it a 7 or an 8 as well. Military government loves its backups just in case.
Okay, fair point. You gave Bigfoot a 5. I'm curious. I'll just ask you a couple of other cryptids just to see if they're all 5s or if like some are higher or lower. So how about like little green men or little gray men, like little aliens from outer space?
Probably about the same, about a 5.
Okay. Chupacabra. You familiar with the chupacabra?
Yeah, out of Southwest in Mexico.
Right.
Yeah,
the goat sucker.
Yeah, I still got to put it around a 5. I'm open-minded here.
Okay. How about orbs? They're not as big now, but I remember in the like late 90s, early 2000s, you took some late night photography with your crappy disposable Kodak camera and you print it out, and there's all these orbs floating around in the sky. I think a majority of people that I knew, for whatever reason, the company that I kept, everyone was convinced that those were like little spirits or little fairies or little like physical representations of consciousness floating around in the world. Where are you at 0 to 10 on orbs?
I mean, I've seen ball lightning myself. So that's got to be a 10 that orbs exist. But whether or not that's a spirit or something, I have maybe a 3 or a 2 somewhere in there.
You've got to be in one of the smallest clubs on the planet of people that have seen ball lightning. That is phenomenal.
Yeah, I saw it. I worked at a summer camp by a swamp, so I spent a lot of time out in the area where you can see that sort of thing.
Just the swamp gas, yeah.
Yeah, the swamp gas sort of thing. Hot summer, yeah.
How about ghosts? And I guess to be more specific, at first, like Victorian style ghost, haunted house, floating around, wearing, a veil of some kind, but opening and closing stuff. Maybe that's more poltergeist. Let's stick with the Victorian ghost first, 0 to 10.
Victorian style ghosts, I lean more towards like 7.
Okay, how about poltergeist? Like like the poltergeist style, flipping open, paranormal activity. How much do you think that exists?
I've also experienced stuff like that before when I was younger, so I'm gonna probably give that a 9 with a little bit there for a chance I'm just deeply mentally ill.
Okay. How about demons? And I mean demons as in like being able to manifest their will or do things in our physical realm. Not just like you have a dream or you got voices that tell you to do bad things, but that like they are actually doing things.
Yeah, you're asking a theology question here. So
I know. You're biased. I get it.
I'm gonna give a 9. I'm gonna give a 9 there. I also think it's possible they're metaphors for like general evil or stuff like that, but I'm pretty convinced on it.
How about Solomon building his temple with his Seal of Solomon and conjuring up demons out of the Red Sea to bring pillars in order to create? How much of that do you think is literal?
personally, I'm going to have to go with like a 1 or a 2, just because I think a lot of the stories of David and Solomon are mythology. Actually, I don't think they really happened.
Okay, interesting. How about let's get away from the 1 to 10 because I have a couple other open ended that we can wrap this up. And then sometimes it's hard to like just put a number on a deep topic like that. So Solomon mythology. But I was almost deriving from what you were saying before of Allegro kind of being a troll and like, haha, I took your Jesus away. Now he's a mushroom. Like, and like, don't you feel like an idiot now? But does this imply that you do believe that there was a historical Jesus? He really did cause miracles, died for our sins, resurrected, all of like, is all that literal verbatim?
Yeah, I'll take that literal. I'll take that literal verbatim. But I also think that, you know, I joke that I'm I'm a part-time atheist. So sometimes I think that I think the story of the historical Jesus as it's told in most Christianity is plausible. It's historically plausible. That doesn't mean that we can prove it. So while I've had very deep experiences of what I believe to be the risen Christ, I also recognize that it can just be my own brain, and I can recognize that maybe historical data could change. So I keep myself open on that and where my faith lies.
Okay, and I'll save the most controversial question for the end, I guess. My favorite question to ask any theologian of any kind: what did Ham see in that tent?
His naked dad.
Is that it? And now he doesn't get a ticket on the boat just because he sees his dad naked, and that's it?
Yeah. Now
my dad naked when I was growing up. I mean,
we're talking about ancient mythology that is has a lot of different cultural norms than we're used to. Where slavery, totally fine. Seeing your dad naked, terrible evil. So it's going to be when you're reading those older stories in the Torah, it's going to be some weird stuff in there that's just going to make no sense to us. But yeah, that's actually what I think the story is trying to convey.
And no euphemism there, like nothing happened in the tent. He just like, oh God, dad, I didn't see you in there. I'm drunk, you're drunk. And then he leaves. And then the next morning his dad's like, unforgivable. You will never be. In fact, your entire family forever unforgiven.
Well, when you have Ham's brother backing up backwards with the blanket to cover the father's nakedness. I think part of it there is like mockery, or just not the idea of not respecting the patriarch in your family. That was the root of everybody's wealth. That was the root of everybody's power, was the patriarch of your clan. And so to see the patriarch of your clan in an embarrassed state like that and to just let it happen was deeply disrespectful. So I know it's a boring take on that, but that's my opinion on it. There could be more there in the underlying Hebrew, but I've seen those papers, but I don't see it personally.
Right. I like that. That's it is a very rational take. I wouldn't say boring. I think it actually makes more sense in context. I've heard some pretty extreme takes on that when there was like active participation in acts we won't speak of. I've also heard an interesting interpretation where he walked into the tent and saw Noah conversing directly with God, or perhaps performing some sort of magic, and that the word naked, or it wasn't even naked. I forgot what the original word was that gets converted into naked when people talk about it. But that this nakedness was really witnessing this like raw communion with God that shouldn't be observed by an outside observer, almost like a two-slit experiment. Like just by him observing it ruined this communication that he had, and that was part of it. That one obviously involves a way more complex explanation. It wouldn't fit in Occam's razor, but I don't like Occam anyways, so I'm okay with it.
Cool.
All right. Kaleb, man, thank you so much. Like I said, we could go on for hours and hours more. We'll wrap it up here. Thanks for talking salvia and Jesus and mushrooms, and I'd love to have you back on and get even deeper into some of these topics.
That sounds good to me, boss.
Thank you. Let people know one more time where they can find you. If you got any books to sell, if you're selling magic mushrooms on the dark web, give us the Bitcoin address, all that stuff.
Yeah, no magic mushrooms, but you can find me at psychedelictheology.com or Psychedelic Theology on Instagram, Facebook, the normal social media. And you can find my Psychedelic Theology podcast, where I talk some about salvia and some about the Virgin Mary, Mazatec, those sorts of things. You can find that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean as the Psychedelic Theology podcast.
Awesome. And for anyone that's listening and like this, I absolutely am going to have to go deeper, specifically into the psychedelics being used to integrate people into the military. Wow, what a topic. I'm absolutely going to be doing that soon. So if you're interested, I'll have you back on for that one too.
Sounds good to me.
Paranoid. Yo. I scribble my life away, driven to write the page. Will it enlighten your brain? Give you the flight, my plane, paper the highs ablaze. Somewhat of an amazing feel when it's real to real. You will engage it. Your favorite, of course, the Lord of an arrangement. I gave you the proper results to hit the pavement. If they get emotional, hey, maybe your language, a game, how they playing it well without Lakers. Evade them, whatever the cost, they are the shapeshift. Snakes get decapitated, met is the apex. Execution of flame you out, nuclear bomb distributed at war, rather gruesome for eyes to see. Max them out, then I light my trees. Blow it off in the face, you're despising me for what though? Calculated and rather cutthroat. Paranoid American must be all the blunt smoke for real. Lord, give me a day away, vacate. They wait around to hate whatever they say. Matters not in the least bit. We get heavy rotate when the beat hits, so thank us, you're welcome. Fuck the niggas for real, you're welcome. They ain't never had a deal, you're welcome. Man, they lacking appeal, you're welcome. Yet they doing it still, you're welcome.